Hello everyone, my name is Nick Merrick. I'm a Client Services Director at Black & Veatch, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. I am particularly grateful to those of you who have stayed with us after last week's challenges, for which I can only apologise. I am confident that today's session will go swimmingly well. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers, Mark Hedges, Asset Data and Information Manager at Anglian Water, and to Chris Steele, Head of Digital Products and Services at Black & Veatch. Today's webinar is the dimensions of data quality, how to measure and improve it without going interstellar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Whilst all attendees are in listen-only mode, you will have the opportunity to submit text questions to Mark and Chris by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and seek to address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be sent 2 hours after the meeting along with a short survey. I'd now like to hand you over to Mark Hedges and Chris Steele. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Hi, everyone. It's Chris here, and I'd first of all just like to extend my thanks to Mark Hedges for agreeing to co-present this webinar today. So thanks, Mark, for agreeing to come along.
No problem, Chris. It's great to be here, and good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's keeping safe and well. Great to be with you.
All right, so let's get started. And as we step through here, we just start with the fundamentals. So why is data quality important for us? And I'm going to talk through a couple of quick examples of the consequences of data quality and how it links together. So why is it important? Well, fundamentally, we use data to make decisions, and the data that we use can either be qualitative or quantitative, and it can come from data that we can count and measure, and also can be subjective and come from opinions and so on. And clearly, there's a reference to the variances in quality of that. So let's look at both of those and examples of that. So the first one, again, keeping sort of almost to the space theme of the title, what we've got here is an example a little while back, 1999, of the Mars lander failure. And some of you may have heard of this and some may not, but effectively this was a data quality issue that caused the loss of that spacecraft. And fundamentally, it was the use of imperial versus metric units. So that piece, very important piece, was overlooked, and which led to a change in the approach for the land, and they got the height wrong, and fundamentally it crashed. So that was obviously poor data quality, but by complete accident. You know, they got it wrong, and it's just the consequences of that. On the right is another one here, and this obviously opposing to the Mars one, it was a deliberate act of poor data quality. And as I'm sure many of you have heard of the company Enron, they chose to falsify their records and in particular what their estimated worth was and the revenue they were earning to their shareholders. And fundamentally, as I'm sure you all know, that led, or was part of the reason that led to Enron's demise. So although maybe not immediately obvious, we use data in all our everyday decisions, and those can be greater or less extent. And it is that qualitative versus quantitative piece. I mean, knowing its quality is obviously key for us. And so let's move us a bit closer to, obviously, this is aimed at asset intensive industry. So what does that look like when we consider data quality from that perspective? And this little infographic here shows typically the flow of data as we make decisions from it. So we take data that comes from the assets and we step it through, and through that data integration piece, we do some analysis typically, we visualize it out in different ways and make decisions. And what you can see is just some examples of that here. So we have a physical producing asset that we maybe combine with other data sets, maybe internal and external. And in this instance, we're looking at energy consumption on that data piece. And then we want to join it together, maybe with financial information and usage information, and service that out in a way that is intuitive to the user. And I guess the main thing here is the bit that pink section can change. Different technologies come along and services that make that easier and more accessible. But fundamentally, the data at the bottom of that stack is what's constant, and the decision at the top is also. So it's thinking about those pieces first when we consider that. And that helps to inform the decisions we make throughout the asset lifecycle. But before I step on through, I'd just like to highlight a fact from or statistic from a previous webinar that Black & Veatch were involved in, where the participants trusted just 4% of the data that they had. So when you look at some of those decisions I've mentioned and some of the processes of how they get applied in our everyday working around assets, that's a pretty low figure, and something that obviously gives rise to the need to address that data quality across the life cycle, as I mentioned. So let's just move into that life cycle piece. And Mark, I appreciate you've almost waited patiently there whilst I've talked through that first slide here. But this piece, I know your experience around the asset life cycle. Can you just sort of talk us through your piece on your background, and then obviously I'll jump in for lending to some of my experiences.
Sure, of course. And I just want to reflect on that previous statistic of 4% of, okay, that was people on that session, Chris, but 4% of people trust their data, which is staggering, isn't it? I mean, if you think about what we're trying to do as an industry, where people are starting to talk about, well, the conversation's been around for a while now around digital transformation and moving towards digital twins of our own, and then connecting ultimately into the national digital twin. One of the fundamental foundations of us being able to do that is data trustworthiness. And if that's where we are, boy, we've got some work to do, haven't we? And yeah, this is why it's great to be talking about this sort of particular topic. You mentioned sort of roles and where me and you come from. So I guess my experience fundamentally is around the top bit of the green polo mint here, but I'm now very much planted in the bottom part of it. But when you think about the asset life cycle and data handover from projects to owner operators, everyone gets really excited at the start of a big project, don't they, where you've got to spin all kinds of things up, and as you deliver the project, as we get through assembly and construction and into commissioning, people begin to look at, well, what's the next project, and the data handover becomes, I guess, something that just has to be done. And one of the big parts of my role is to transform that into a seamless, integrated part of the delivery of the asset life cycle. It's part of an outcomes-based way of delivering projects, and alliancing may well be the part through that. But yeah, I just wanted to just sort of reiterate really the value of data. And we know that the material value of our assets it does decline as the age of the asset sort of grows, and the static data, the data about those assets kind of remains fairly level. But if we do get this data quality piece right, and we are able to move towards a digital twin and transforming the way that we operate through digitally enabled decisions, then potentially the value of that dynamic data that's being provided by the assets actually increases. So that's certainly one way of looking at it. But currently, my role is to foster that data trustworthiness, and to make sure that we really are founding those great decisions around our assets on really good data, and therefore we can trust the decisions. And I guess, Chris, that's where sort of your experience comes in again. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, obviously, it's a good insight into that earlier phases of the asset life cycle. For me, and I'm sure for many on the call, I've sort of felt the consequences of poor data quality around that bottom piece with the operations and maintenance phase, and hence we even want to call out asset information management in this life cycle. It's often either we don't utilize the data that has been provided by delivery partners from that capital phase, or by design or otherwise. So either we haven't been able to access it properly, or we just don't use it. And of course, then it's the management piece, a lot more dynamic in this phase, as you mentioned, and we're very much interested in asset performance and how it drives future investment planning. And also driving your in-year program, be it how you operate and maintain the asset. So data quality comes key, and obviously, as you rightly mentioned, Mark, that customers piece along the bottom is fundamentally what the whole asset life cycle is for.
Of course.
Yeah, and so I guess picking up on those users, Mark. I know we've discussed in many ways around those different users across the life cycle.
Yeah, so it's a great way to bring this to life, isn't it? When you look through the different lenses, the different user stories that are absolutely reliant on good quality data, and this is where we foster that data trustworthiness. It's right across the piece, from the asset planner who absolutely is completely reliant on the historical data and how things have performed in the past, who might want that to be far more dynamic and trust that data so that they know that they're making the right decisions in terms of future investments. The designer of future projects is absolutely focused on a different lens through which they're looking at the same data. It's a fascinating way of looking at this life cycle and bringing it to life. And Chris, do you want to pick up on a couple of others around the bottom there?
Yeah, so just obviously that operations and maintenance background, there's that demand, to run your site in an optimal form or run your network, whatever it might be, and to do that, you're I guess balanced between you want to make purely data-driven decisions because that gives a level of confidence to it, but you also need to validate those with the subject matter expertise to go along with it. So it's the power of both of those really, and considering obviously business plans and other things lay out what the company's trying to deliver on. So it's requirements to customers and so on, and its objectives. But also you got to sort of tier that back to say, well, from each user, what does that really mean for the site manager, for example? What does it really mean for the designer, as you mentioned? So it's, as you say, it's really bringing them to life, really.
Yeah, and for us as Anglian Water, we exist, purely to serve customers and to protect the environment that we operate in. So this is absolutely core to our real sort of values as an organization. That it's not peripheral; it's absolutely centered on the core.
Yeah, and I guess if we drill down into that, just moving on through, this I think is a great slide where you come from obviously your team, Mark, around understanding the baseline and your approach to understanding data quality at the minute. Can you just sort of take us through this, because I think it's a great slide.
Yeah, sure. And I'm lucky enough to work with some great people who have created this. It's just one of the tools that we use around our sort of asset surveying function. This is a risk-based tool that just allows us to identify what we know against what we should know in terms of in simple terms against the asset count on our sites. there's the level of data that we actually have against the level of data we know we should have, and those two things are at the moment not the same thing. And this particular tool is used by our asset survey technicians to fundamentally predict the risk around either surveying or not surveying a particular site. And as we grow our knowledge, as we go around our asset base completely and build our knowledge around those, then the more and more accurate this tool becomes. And I guess we're gonna touch on one of the main criteria of asset data quality pretty shortly, Chris, but this one certainly sort of looks at those. But in terms of Black & Veatch, what do you guys find around that, going back to that point around we've got this much asset data, but in actual fact we think we should have a different amount? What have you found in that?
Yeah, and appreciate you've mentioned, you referenced in one of the criterion, which we will talk on a little bit, of completeness, which is what this is looking at. And
Sure.
I guess it brings in this concept around dark data or dark assets, which is fundamentally we know they're out there, but we don't have any information on them. And that, I appreciate what you've got here is saying, okay, by what we expect to find for a typical process or arrangement of assets, what's our systems actually telling us from a master system of record standpoint, and understanding, as well, that with this, it is a risk-based approach. So you're looking at your critical process areas and saying, well, clearly there's a cost, risk, benefit piece on understanding what information you hold, and it's fundamentally then the decisions you can make from it against those critical process areas. And this probably segues quite nicely into a poll, where we have obviously looking for everyone who's kindly joined to answer some questions around this, or one question, and I'm very keen to see the feedback from that. So we'll hand over to that poll now, and we'll hopefully see where those results come in. So I think this is the point. Hopefully everyone can select their answer that fits them best, and Mark and I can then deliberate on the answer.
I think it says we can select up to 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris.
And
just while everyone's
well, actually.
My message says don't vote, but
yeah, okay.
Just on that previous slide, Chris, I guess an element that we've not really talked about is also sort of criticality of assets, isn't it? That's got to sort of come into things, and criticality it's a point and a topic on its own, really.
It is, and one thing actually which you called out there, that criticality, that's typically the approach we take, and I did have an interesting stat amongst those, the dark assets piece. Typically we find sort of 20 to 25% of clients we work for, and those asset intensive organizations, that's typically the number of assets where we know they're out there, but we're just not holding any information on them.
Chris, if I could just interrupt you for a second, if you'll excuse me. We've had about two-thirds of the votes in now, so if we'll close the voting in a few seconds, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And here are our results. Interesting. That obviously topping out there. What's required from it and by whom, for what purpose. And visibility of what data exists. I mean, that's obviously a straight reference to what we talked around with the dark assets there, Mark.
Yeah, there's dark assets, and I guess the understanding what's required by whom and for what purpose goes back to the user stories that we were talking about earlier that exist around that asset life cycle, which is a fundamental, but it's nice to see the results kind of backing up the importance of that.
Yeah, And when we touch on a little bit as we step on through, you know, and get into, okay, if this sort of sets the scene of what data quality is and why it's important to us on the process side of things about how we go to assess it and fundamentally improve it, that really comes through at that point as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. Do you know what, the team that looked after the Mars lander, I'm just looking at the results of the second one there, the impact that poor data quality can have if we were to survey them. I wonder whether that might be kind of a little bit higher.
Yeah. Well, this is and kind of kicking back to the you know the theme of this and you know, very often the consequences of poor data quality, a bit like the reactive nature of things, you don't realize how bad that is, or there's potential for how bad it is until it actually happens, you know.
Exactly.
That's I guess you don't know what you don't know is maybe a way of looking at it.
No, exactly. And I think we were sort of talking in previous conversations about you know, empathy around sort of data quality, certainly poor data quality, is quite important. You know, it's just important that we understand that it's an issue that's maybe not you know, tremendously easy to get your head around and to start to look at, but it's absolutely possible to do that. I guess it's reference to our session title. You don't need to go Interstellar to start to understand it.
Yeah, and it's a good point, and I guess we can move on from the poll now. And thanks, obviously, to everyone who participated. Very insightful.
Interesting.
And yeah, absolutely. And so we can moving on from that. That's and picking up on your point, Mark. You know, well, let's actually get into how do we do it. And so I guess this is almost a slide. It gets worse before it gets better, but it's just to say there are many dimensions to data quality, and this is where the quantitative and qualitative piece really comes back. You know, we've touched on completeness, but you can see obviously it's in here, but there are many in this, and the thing to think about here is or be conscious of is that you want to pick the criterion that are relevant to you as an organization, and we'll talk about those, you know, that we've used previously and we've worked on with Anglian and with Mark and his team. But you know, that difference between a factual measured criterion versus this subjectivity, and subjectivity, as I'm sure you can appreciate, can end up being the more difficult one to get a definitive answer on, because it's typically based on opinion, and it's almost second, third stage. You're not able to go and measure it, whereas the measures on the left obviously are. So that's that quantitative and qualitative piece is very key in how we approach it. And I think then that's moving on nicely, Mark, to what we've gone with Anglian Water and our assessment that we've been working on together.
Yes, absolutely. So, Chris, do you want me to sort of talk about the importance of assurance, or do you want to explain CARTI first?
Well, I'll do an explanation of assurance, and I appreciate it's assurance that we as Black & Veatch give to you, Anglian Water, but you know, CARTI is a set of measures. Not only is it sort of, you know, catchy, I guess, but in an acronym there, but what we've got is each of these criterion for us. We've assessed which ones offer the most value in terms of the answers that they give, and as you can see, as it's working away around, completeness we've covered off, the accuracy of the information that you have, and then moving on around the reliability, existence, integrity, and timeliness. And what we have done is, I'm sure that look of almost food grading was deliberate, in so much as we want to surface out understanding the quality of data in a business as usual form. And so by design, it's you know, a glance at these measures, you can get a viewpoint of your data quality, and this can become a dynamic measure. So we use, as you can see, the Institute of Asset Managers come out with subject-specific guidance on how you approach assessing data quality. We've adopted that, and we've proven out this methodology to assessing across these criterion that we're now applying within Anglian Water.
And you know, from our point of view, Chris, what's really important about this is that this approach is a sustainable one from our point of view. You know, what we want to do is we want to grow our own competence and our own assuredness about doing this kind of work to the point where we do become, you know, we can exist on our own with this stuff, bearing in mind that we've decided to start with sort of static data and, you know, only a selection of the attributes that sit within our asset base, but nonetheless, it's a great start. So what's really important to us is that we're working with you guys because you bring that element of assuredness with it. It's got that quality stamp all over it, and the fact that the approach is sustainable and we can grow our own internal skills and become self-sufficient. It's an important part. And just on a lighter note, I'd just like to reassure everyone that the graphic you see on the screen is an example. It's only an illustration. If my R score is actually 23%, I have my work cut out. But yeah, we haven't got our own results for that yet.
Yeah, and I guess picking up on your point on the reusable process, you know, that links itself well to, you know, being disciplined around the criterion that you use. And obviously, as what we've used over time, we've settled on these ones, as I mentioned, around the value it can bring. And you know, there's a piece of actually, this is the value that the measure brings, and also that it is possible to measure it. You know, some of those criterion that you see, or dimensions that we looked at earlier, can be very difficult to actually undertake, and it's particularly once we get beyond a single assessment. So if we want to move to an enterprise level assessment, then obviously things are get more complex, and we also look to automate it, and that probably just sinks in quite nicely to, I'll talk through a bit of a demonstration of how we apply that here. So
great stuff.
Okay, so how do we do it? And there's a little bit to this, and it's sort of linear in its approach, and I'll just step through it as we go. So the first one is effectively defining the data sets. So this is really at the heart of what decisions do you want to make against, and that therefore lends to, well, what data is it we need to inform those, and they'll come from multiple different sources and requirements, and that's why we want to adopt this risk-based approach to when we look at that. So I mentioned before that we want to start with those critical assets. Well, the reason they're critical is typically because we've assessed it against a number of criterion, normally linked to the business values and its objectives, and therefore that gives you that line of sight, especially when we think about it from an asset management perspective, to this is worthwhile from a cost, risk, and performance focus on our efforts. And typically we would start with the asset register normally. We don't have to, but we normally start with the asset register because obviously in an asset intensive organization, it lends itself to so many decisions from it when we think back to that life cycle piece. And incidentally, or not incidentally, by design, that's where we've approached with obviously yourself, Mark, and your team, is to focus on the GIS based assets or mastered assets and SAP as your master system of record for your non-infra asset register.
That's right. Yeah.
So that risk-based approach. So once we've defined those assets, then we've got to go through and create the dimension logic, and to ultimately lead to assessing the asset. So this is just a little excerpt. And I'll just talk through each of these. You can see the measures as you have them. And this is the piece where we very much work collaboratively with, in the case of Anglian, obviously with Mark and his team, to say, okay, as a user, this is what the requirement is. And so completeness is pretty much straightforward, as I'm sure you can appreciate. It's fundamentally, is the data there or not? Then we move into accuracy, and again, this is a quantitative approach here, where we can say, okay, this is the values that it must be between, and that therefore we can quantify the number of data points that are in that range or outside that range. Reliability is where it gets a little bit more difficult and needs some thought. And so normally we look at this in terms of, is the data automated or not? So you can, and it is possible to have reliable data that is manually exported and transformed and provided, but typically, especially given the types of organizations that we work within, we really want to look at that automated and also around the calibration piece for its accuracy, or sorry, for the reliability piece. Timeliness, same thing again, really. It can be difficult to get the dimension right, but you've really got to look and take each individual data set and consider it on its own merit. But it's how often that user needs to make the decision from that data. So if they need it, they need permanent data pulled at every 15 minutes, or they need an answer once a day, or they need the data to make a decision once a day or once a week, then you're almost working back from that decision to understand what the timeliness needs to be. Moving on from there is the integrity piece. So this is where we look at really master data management comes into play. And this is where we say, okay, how many places does this data exist? And this is where we link across the different data sets through what's typically known as a foreign key, and that allows us to form that relation from, well, in this instance, some pressure information. Is it verified to the attributes are linked and correct to what that asset is? So when we think way back at the design phase and so on, we stipulate a number of attributes that we want to hold on assets. Well, this is about capturing those correctly and how that integrity piece of that particular pressure node in this instance. And then the last piece is the existence. So I'm sure we've all been in a position where we've had information presented to us because it's always been there, and we get an automated report and whatever it might be. But actually, does this reflect what's actually out there in the real world? So does a physical asset exist? And so what we do is, obviously, we want to make this, we want to verify that how that's been codified, that asset, is it reference to the physical asset in the network in this instance. And we also want to verify, you can use different means to do that also. So you can use other data variables to confirm that basically with those as a collective, then this data point that you're being presented with, or the answer it's giving, is valid. So when you think of sort of logic, then this steps it out of how you can understand whether it's within tolerance and not within tolerance. So you consider them each independently. You don't want to sort of blur the lines of that. But that's just an example of how we take through that each of those dimensions and our approach to assessment. And so if that's stage 2 of 4. 3 is around the data owners and stewards. And again, I know Mark has highlighted this fact. This is really important, particularly from a sustainability component. So this is the difference between one answer, a one-off answer, and being able to sustain data quality and actually your route to improve it, really.
Sorry, Chris, just a point from me on that one is that it's really important from an organizational point of view that there's a real desire that the view on data changes, and this is what's happened with us. So data ownership and stewardship is beginning to be written into people's roles. It's becoming a real role. It may not be a full-time role in terms of the owner, but certainly stewards are absolutely sort of focused on their roles, and it's really, you know, it's critical, that piece from an organizational point of view.
Yeah, and it's useful to highlight that, you know, and I appreciate it's down the bottom is the difference between a data owner and a data steward. Probably the easiest way to look at this is the difference between someone who's responsible and accountable.
Exactly that. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
So stewards do all the heavy lift, really, I think, and
yes,
owners are just accountable for the consequence. But there we go. So that's that third stage of, and very important to stop it being a one-time assessment. How do you look to improve it? And then moving on from that piece, then. Step back there, is the fourth stage, and as I alluded to a second ago, you want to implement a sustainable measurement process, and this is where you've really got to look at that qualitative and quantitative piece of that's really where it comes back around again, because if you do have that qualitative assessment, then that's going to require typically, you know, engagement, interview, opinion, that sort of thing. And makes it very difficult to automate. So you do want to seek to have those quantitative pieces as much there as possible to allow you to move on and automate. And speaking of automation, this is really the key to how you scale it. And this is a tool set that we use. That there's many out there. Obviously, this is FME for those who are familiar with it. And what I just wanted to show you is take one of those measurement dimensions, so completeness, obviously, and just demonstrate how we go about automating that process. So what you see, and I appreciate you can't see the detail here, but I will zoom up a little bit in a second, is we kind of break it down into these sort of three areas. So what we're doing is querying the master system of record, which is very much key. We don't want to get into taking extracts of information to then go and perform an assessment on it. You want to query the master system because ironically, you can actually introduce data quality issues by doing that. So you want to automate the data preparation, which is what that first piece is doing there. And then from there, you want to script this attribute validation. So this is those dimensions logic that we talked through a moment ago, and engaging with the data users and so on, and the decisions that they make. That helps form out that logic, of which you basically write in here as a set of qualifying statements that get run against each attribute within the data set. And it's probably worth noting here, we do apply this down to individual attribute level. So this is which you can sort of roll back up again, and particularly pertinent for Anglian water. We're doing it at that individual asset level, of which they can see what then their data quality looks like on a process, on a site or a catchment area, on a network, and so on and so forth. So you're doing it down to that individual attribute level, and using tool sets like this allow you to do that. And then this last piece is obviously the reporting of results. So you also want to then bring that together and present it in a way through, you know, if it's Power BI or Tableau or ClickView or any other application, or just a straight up spreadsheet, whatever it is. But you want to present that answer, and the key is consistency. And so you want to automate that process to generate those results, so as you can effectively rinse and repeat the process over and over again. And so just taking one element of that, this is a sort of zoomed up view of what that looks like. And I appreciate it's not 100% clear, but hopefully clear enough for you to understand the point I want to make, which is if this is the query, the actual completeness validation piece is just this section. And quite easy for completeness because it is just looking for null values. But if you can see here, the rest is about this bottom layer is then the assessing that completeness against every attribute that's in that individual data set. And the top layer is the reference source data set of saying, okay, well, the unprocessed data, what is the result? So as you can then get the for argument's sake, the 23% piece or the 80%. What is it against the source data set? And then the last piece is around transforming its results back out again. So it's just to give a very quick snapshot. I appreciate it's limited what you can do in a webinar, of what you can show and maybe what people are interested in, but it's just to show that that's the process you take, and you build these so that you can reuse them from multiple different data sets. So you got components that you can avail of depending on what you're doing. And so as we sort of come back out again of that detail, let's just cover off some of the challenges and lessons learned, and appreciate we're back to the asset life cycle again. And Mark, probably useful again if we keep the same format as previous, if you can sort of take us around a little bit of this life cycle, and I'll feed in after you. Probably a nice way to do it.
Sure. Yes. So this is just about sort of joining some bits together. So we've spoken about the asset cycle in the context of the data quality and the user stories, but this really is the application of things that are becoming sort of more and more sort of common, potentially out of the government's BIM mandate. So we're talking about exchange information requirements. I have a personal view that we need to transform that again into exchange data requirements ultimately, but exchange information requirements is a great start, and the asset information model that informs that. We began to become sort of more comfortable with those terms. And when I reflect on what we're doing within Anglian, it's kind of forcing us to look at our own sort of process blocks and plant groups, and kind of capture those in a very visual way to make sure that actually the AIM and the EIR are actually sort of correct as we come through the delivery phase, and we get the data trustworthiness. And I'm going to go back to that point again because it's so important. The data trustworthiness, not just from delivery into ownership and operation, but when we hand that data back again for the next project, we've got to build the level of data trust so that we can really bring this asset information lifecycle to life and make it real for people, and that means data trustworthiness again right at the very center of one of those sort of key building blocks of that. I guess, Chris, that sort of builds through the sort of data dictionary and digital playbooks. What are the strategies around to sort of again bring that to life, make it real?
Yeah, and this, while some of this terminology may be new for some, but and this is effectively the data dictionary is that rule set. And once you go and formulate all of those dimensions and logics, this is your reference point to say, for that data set, this is the rules we use. And you can grow it out to cover many different data sets, but it is that reference point. And the playbooks is simply getting a consistent way of how to do it. That's the plan, tangible plan that someone can pick up, follow it, and say, this is how I apply a data quality assessment. And that then loops around, obviously, into the importance of the ownership and stewardship we talked about. And then I guess the last pieces are well, certainly the two at the bottom are very much bugbears of mine, which is this asset registration and deregistration, very seldom done well. It's a process that's difficult to get right. But the consequences are quite large whenever you're trying to make decisions of assets that are not there or not what you thought were going to be, incomplete data and so on. And following on from that is just the unstructured data piece. Obviously, given its name, it's very difficult to make any sort of assessment of unstructured data. There are tools out there that can help with it, even through to AI type services that can help. But you almost don't want to do that by design. If you can get the piece further back around the life cycle right and configure your systems correctly, then it allows easier access to the data that's captured. And I think, Mark, there's a nice piece just looping back to that decisions then.
Correct. Yeah, when we begin to sort of think about what the digital twin will enable, and that decisions piece is all about that, isn't it, Chris? It's the key enabler to a successful digital twin.
Yeah, which probably sits quite nicely as we step through and I mean, looking at your roadmap here, or Anglian Water's roadmap, Mark, that you've been involved with. This, I think, is a great slide showing how you guys, obviously where we are, but where you're going.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key stages of this, really, we can sort of split into three main bits. So there's the sort of proof of concept, and you will see sort of CARTI there absolutely as part of the key enabling bits that you need. Moving into enterprise deployment, across the Anglian water estate. What have we got to do to scale it across our complete business? And then ultimately building towards the digital twin and national digital twin. And I'm going to state it again, the data quality part of what we're doing at the moment will be crucial to the success ultimately of digital twin. It really is absolutely central to it.
Yeah, and I know that obviously, we're working with various thought leadership and industry groups. So the reference some of them in the left there, and those principles, when we look at the Gemini principles we're adopting in, and they very much highlight and support the process around understanding data quality and how you go about measuring it. Which brings us on nicely, I think, to the sort of last piece. So the key things to remember to avoid going interstellar. Well, there's four main parts. Start with the critical decisions. What is it you need to make? I think we sort of labored the point enough. It is a data to decisions piece. So what are those that mean the most to you? And don't tackle everything all at once. And from that, then it's keeping it simple. You've seen how many dimensions there were in the previous slide. If you try and take all of them on, or too many of them on, you just won't get past. You won't finish the first assessment. So pick the ones that are going to give you the most, the optimal cost, risk, and benefit. Really, is the key around that. And the next one then is obviously getting people involved, and Mark and his team. I know this is very close to you, finding the right people who can finding your stewards, and then obviously getting that ownership as well.
Yes, yeah, and the transfer of the enthusiasm, Chris, for good data quality. It's one of the key parts of my role, and something that I'm really focused on is to get the organisation enthused about good quality data. We talked in the past about previously delivery has been absolutely about the realisation of the assets into a treatment works or whatever it is that, or a pipeline, whatever it is that you're building, the realization of those material assets. Well, the realization of accurate data about those assets has got to be equally or more important than that.
Yeah, 100%. And next nicely, this last bit, which is we want to limit subjectivity. So keep qualitative where you can do it, and keep it out of the assessment. So that or quantitative for the assessment, qualitative for the assessing the results. Go and get the opinions and the root cause, and seek the improvement with your people, and get those opinions on how to solve it after the fact. If you keep that that quantitative piece for the assessment, you'll make it a heck of a lot easier to undergo a successful and sustainable data quality improvement program. So that about rounds us out, I think, Mark, and I think we're going to hand over some questions.
Thank you, Mark and Chris. I have to say that was absolutely fascinating. I've learned a lot in the process, particularly things like, as you said at the end there, keeping it simple and maintaining the people aspect as you go through. We've had some questions coming in, if I can just relay these to you. One from Simon. If it's dark data, then I'd suggest it's not critical to the business and only required for the company financial status. As such, should we not focus our efforts on improving the quality of critical assets instead?
I think it's a fair point. You know, that it didn't start that way. You know, that those dark assets weren't always that way. And over time, that process, you know, of managing the asset through the life cycle or managing the information around it throughout the life cycle gets lost and deteriorates. So there's an element of truth in that of you know, your critical assets. You tend to know about them. All I would say is that experience, and perhaps Mark, you can speak to this also. You know, when we get around buried infrastructure and things like that we're not aware of, we all know the consequences of when we have pipe bursts and things like that. And not all dark assets are hidden visibly, but it's just an example of saying, like, you know, if you don't know about it, then there's nothing wrong with changing how you approach an asset or deeming it as less critical, as long as you know that's why you're doing it. To not know, I think, is the bigger risk.
I completely agree, Chris. And you know, the asset that we're talking about, be it a pipe, a pump, a valve, you know, it may well not have been critical through time because it's continued to do its job. It's when it doesn't do its job. That's when you start to run into trouble of potentially customer impact, environmental impact, reputational impact. You know, we all, I'm sure, know of particular assets that have been sort of spinning away for years, just quite happily doing their job. But it is ultimately when that asset fails to do what it's meant to do that you open yourself up to increase risk. And criticality is an interesting one, isn't it? Because, you know, if you're thinking about criticality in terms of, for example, water treatment process, you know, the attention goes to the assets that are directly delivering water to the network and therefore customers.
Yeah, the critical path, I think.
It's quite easy, isn't it? And I remember we were talking before to ignore the little sump pump that sits spinning away in the corner whenever you need it, and that might not be critical to the process, but boy, it becomes so when it fails and you know, you flood your MCC or it pops your site. You know, it's
yeah.
So criticality in itself is a fascinating sort of a whole topic, really.
If I could ask, move on to another one, if that's okay, thank you.
Sure.
Question from Carl here. Do Anglian Water consider carbon data capture and fidelity as higher priority, especially as this could be more costly to assess?
I'll politely let you answer that one, Mark.
Well, carbon is hugely important to us. I think that, you know, with my knowledge, and I know that I would defer to maybe better experts in the organization, but in terms of far as I'm concerned, my experience comes from a focus on carbon in delivery, so embodied carbon. But I guess this question really comes from an operational carbon side of things, which is becoming more and more prominent as being important to the business. So possibly not in the past, but definitely going forwards.
And I guess this links up nicely to the decisions piece. You know, we talked about asset management and line of sight to your business objectives and what the business is trying to achieve. Then as carbon features higher than, you know, following the process as we laid out there, that should help say, okay, well, the decisions that we need to make are more carbon related decisions, and that therefore drives you down to, okay, well, what is the data that we need to make that decision?
Yes, and there's been huge focus in our organisation on both embodied and operational carbon. So that I think that it's important to us already, and it will become even more important to us in the future.
Okay, I think hopefully got time for one or perhaps two quickies. One from William here, more of a statement than a question. Not mentioned, or perhaps I missed it. There's also a large aspect of tackling employee culture and behaviour and making data quality the responsibility of everybody in the same way as health and safety if we want to really get to where we want to be. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we could both jump in here, but you know, we're it's highlighting this, and perhaps not well enough, is that data stewardship and ownership piece. You know, that's an educational element in its own right, where we're saying, okay, this is why it's important, and this is what we need you to do as part of your role to manage it. And of course, you know, with people comes the culture and behaviors around it. So you know, what's in it for me question and those sorts of things. You've got to demonstrate either through the negative of this is the consequences when we manage our data poorly, or these are the benefits when we manage it correctly. Either way you go, and inevitably it's a mix of both. That helps to inform those and fundamentally change the culture and behaviors around data quality. Would that be a fair assessment, Mark, from what you see and with your team and the sort of journey you guys are on?
Yeah, absolutely, and the establishment of data owners and data stewards, whose job it is, you know, this is absolutely written into the roles to be very, very clear about what our rules are and what the obligations are around our data, and it becomes people's jobs to make sure that we are improving the data all the time. It's, you know, it's not a given. You know, you have to build this responsibility in, and maybe because we're coming from the past where data wasn't, or we've gone through a cycle where data wasn't quite so important, but we're beginning to increasingly realize that it actually is one of the key points of the organization. So you know, that combination of ownership and stewardship is critical towards, I think, changing the culture of the organization so that we do realize the value of better data.
Thank you, Mark. A final question here from Peter. Clearly data quality is vital, but in the real world we only have what we have. So perhaps you could have an example of quick wins from just using what we have now. So that's either a 30-second answer or the 2-hour answer there. 30-second would be better. So what can we, so data that we have now, how best do we use it?
Yeah, I think you can go through and identify the decisions you need to make very quickly. So we make, you know, and we do that by role. So take our organization and split it into 3 levels. And I'm going very quickly to answer this and crude perhaps, but 3 levels, and say the key decisions at that executive or strategic level, tactical level, and operational level. These are the main ones we got to answer. What are the data points associated to those decisions? And that's where you prioritize your effort. When you're assessing data quality, and of course you can't assess data that you don't have. So by default, you know that you're making use of the data you've already got, and of course that can give you the as is position and target where you start to improve it. So I hope that is perhaps in a 30-second answer.
And I'll back Chris up on that. Couldn't agree more.
Okay, well, we've still got a few questions that are hanging. I haven't had a chance to answer mine either, but I think we'll have to draw it to a conclusion there. But thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chris, for what has been an absolutely fascinating webinar today. And thanks to all of those who have joined us today and have persevered from last week. So thank you very much, and I hope we can see you electronically, of course, or for the next webinar on the 23rd of June, the impact of COVID-19 on the water and the power industry. But until then, thank you, Mark, thank you, Chris, and to those that attended. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.